do that.
Okay. Is that good now?
Yep, you can go ahead.
Okay. Awesome. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Chuck Johnson. I am the historian, the director of education at the Erie Maritime Museum, and which is the home port of the US Brig Niagara, kind of like I mentioned in the lead up to this. I've been doing this for the last 4 years here in Erie. So I'm not an Erie native. I'm not a Pennsylvania native. But I have family connections to Pennsylvania. It's a state that I love very, very much, and I love being here. Prior to that, I was the education director at the Battleship Massachusetts. So my background is actually in World War II history, World War II Navy history. And I did that for a few years. I hold a master's in public history, military history as well. I come from a Navy background. I've served in the Navy on active duty and reserve for a total of about 12 years. I'm still in the Navy Reserve. And so I've never really gotten away from Navy history, Navy heritage, and all of that. So, like I said, been doing this museum thing, histories thing for about 7 years now. And it's something I love doing. So tonight I get to present Erie shipbuilding heritage, which is a topic that I think I've only in 4 years presented twice. This presentation that we've done here in the past is really a gloss over, covering 200 plus years of history of shipbuilding and boat building heritage here in PA, in Erie, PA. So if there's something that I'm skipping past, it's not because I don't think it's important. It's just because there's a lot to cover. So what I'm going to try to do is break this down for you in an easy to understand and digestible way. But if you do have questions, obviously feel free to ask them in the chat. I'll try to get to them at the end. If it's a word that you just don't understand and you'd like some clarification on that, obviously please feel free to interrupt and I'll try to answer that. So yes, Erie shipbuilding heritage. Who are we? We're the Erie Maritime Museum. This is our mission statement. I won't really dive too much into that, but just note that we are the stewards covering maritime history and heritage of the Commonwealth, including civilian innovation, military service, and Pennsylvania's contribution to Great Lakes industry and our environment. So highlighted a couple words there. We at the Erie Maritime Museum are administered by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's Historical and Museum Commission. So a lot of what we talk about, well, yeah, it's Erie's history, Erie's maritime history, but we are the PHMC's, as we call ourselves, maritime museum. So a lot of what we talk about obviously is covering the Commonwealth's heritage on the lakes and beyond. As you can see in this building, it had been mentioned a little bit, but if you look in the photo, you can see the joint library building. We share a building with the Blasco Public Library, which is the Erie County Public Library System. It is in a building that was once Penelec's East Front Street generator station, which powered and supplied steam heat to Lower Erie from the mid 19-teens to 1991. I could be wrong. But for a good chunk of Erie's history, the building that we operate out of was a coal-fired steam generating station. So we talk a little bit about that in our museum. As you can see in the photo here down at the bottom right, is one of our generators that we still have on site. There was 5 of them in the building. So a lot of people who come to the museum take a look at the architecture and are in awe of the masonry, and then they're hit with a generator and trying to figure out what kind of museum they just walked into. But yeah, the Maritime Museum, we talk a lot about the War of 1812 and beyond, specifically because of this vessel, which we built our museum around, which is the US Gunbrigg Niagara. This is the 4th iteration of the ship. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ship, the reconstruction timelines of the vessel towards the end of the program tonight. But this beautiful, majestic lady sails the Great Lakes and has been in a sailing school vessel status since the 1990s, and was started construction in 1988. So for 30 seasons, she's been sailing and teaching people from around the world the art of square rig seamanship, and we're very proud of that vessel and that connection. So as I began to talk about the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, we are operated by the state's historic agency, which we've been in existence in one way or another since 1945. We collect, conserve, and interpret Pennsylvania's heritage through the archives, the State Museum of PA, the PA Trails of History, which is what we're part of, the State Historic Preservation Office, and the Bureau of Management Services, which kind of administers our admin side of things. So those blue signs that you see all over the state, they're erected by us, and we have sites across the Commonwealth, across what we call the PA Trails of History. We are part of the Military History Trail. If you wanted to experience these places, you can please, I'll put in the comments later the website so you can check out all of our sites. But this gives you a gist of what we do. Military Trail, we have places like the Erie Maritime Museum, the Military Museum, I think I just said that, the Fort Pitt, Bushy Run Battlefield, places like historic homes like the Joseph Priestley House, Conrad Weiser, Daniel Boone, Pennsbury Manor, and we have the Industrial Trail, which I think we could technically be part of as well. But starting with Drake Well, the Railroad Museum down towards you all is one of my favorites. I probably shouldn't say that live, but that's one of my favorite museums in PHMC. Anthracite, Scranton Irons furnaces, and of course our rural farms with old economy. So there's a lot of history that we talk about. Please check us out. It's a pretty wide scope that we present. So our collections, our exhibits, like I had mentioned, the War of 1812, one of our largest is actually shipbuilding tools, which plays right into this. Historic photographs, we have about 3,000 archival and artifacts in our collection. But whether it be sailors of the Michigan and Wolverine, which we'll talk about later, maritime art, industry, lake recreation, we're actually bringing out a new exhibit probably in the next couple of weeks, which if you follow our Facebook, you'll be able to see photos of our new ice boat that was built in 1900 that is on display, going to be on display in our second floor exhibit spaces. Coast Guard life-saving service, ship models, uniforms, clothing, our Panelec station, and navigational tools, aids, and so much more. So there's a lot for us to present, and I guess now we'll get into why everyone's here tonight. So Erie Shipbuilding and Heritage. Shipbuilding heritage is, again, it's a broad theme. But we're going to try to break it down into 3 phases as much as I can. The first phase, I guess, would be military aspect, War of 1812, historical commerce on the Great Lakes, trade and all that. Then we enter a period where we start to shift into boat building, so smaller craft, fishing tugs, and so on. And then where we are today, which is more or less maintenance and layup. So shipbuilding industry is not nearly what it used to be, but we still play a role here in Erie, and we're very proud of that heritage. So I guess we'll start with the geography. So why has Erie really grown up and focused its energy on that waterfront? Well, I tell people all the time, and I've heard it from a colleague of mine, Erie would not exist without Presque Isle. And I don't know if anybody's ever seen Presque Isle or visited. I know a few people have, but Presque Isle is a sandspit, this thing that stretches out into the lake and offers a safe haven. And it's something that we've attached ourselves to here in Erie since before European colonization, American colonization, European forts, all of that had come into play. It actually is the origin story. It's the focus of the origin story for the Erie Native Americans, which is where we get our namesake for whether it be Lake Erie, Erie County, New York, Erie County, PA, all of these places that have attached themselves to the name Erie. The Erie natives actually describe it, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase here, but their origin story is actually really interesting, and I like to talk about it because it kind of gives you a glimpse as to why why this city exists today, in the southwest corner, the southeast corner of Lake Erie. So they describe that the blessings of the Great Spirit furnished the lake with an abundance of fish, which is very true. The Erie, in search of a place where the sun sank into the waters, started to sail along the Great Lakes, the Lake Erie, and to look for this place. And when they were on the water, great storm crept up, and flashes of lightning showed fishermen fighting for their lives, and they appealed to the Great Spirit for help in their hour of peril. And what the Great Spirit did is he took his right arm, grabbed the hills overlooking the lake, and extended his left arm into Lake Erie to provide a safe haven in the fury of the storm. And that arm exists today in the form of a sandbar, and that's where the Presque Isle apparently had come from. Presque Isle, the Erie natives lived there for quite some time in the bluffs overlooking the lake. We have archaeological evidence of fishing and hunting on Presque Isle, but no real settlement. But we start to see Europeans coming through the area. And in 1753, the French built their first fort, Presque Isle. I'm going to butcher it if I try to speak in the French way of saying it, but essentially what it meant is almost island, because there is a little bit of sand that connected the majority of Presque Isle to the mainland. The French are there because of the fur trade. You can see in this painting, which is on display in the museum, by a gentleman, local artist Joseph Plavkin, who painted a series of paintings like this. But in this one, it's one of my favorites. So you see the Native Americans trading with the French fort, which is the first true European imprint in modern day Erie, Pennsylvania. They're going to be here till 1760. Then the British will move in 1763 at the tail end of the 7 Years' War, and they build a fort. So there's two forts. Finally, they go away. The Americans are going to come in 1789. The Iroquois Confederacy, which is the Iroquois-speaking natives that lived in upstate New York, Lower Canada, are going to sell the land that is the Erie Triangle to Pennsylvania for, I think it's like $3,200, I believe. The Erie Triangle becomes part of Pennsylvania on March 3rd, 1792. And quite early on, they're going to hire a surveyor, Andrew Ellicott. He surveyed Washington, D.C. as well. And then later that year in 1795, the first American settlers, so the first true settlers, are going to arrive in Erie. The Reed family, which are from Uxbridge, Massachusetts, are going to move from Geneva, New York, to build the first log cabin at the mouth of Mill Creek in Erie. So it's the first non-fort permanent building in Erie. The Reed family quickly become heavily engaged in shipbuilding and maritime industry. So it's a name to remember. So the first actual ship to be built in Erie, or the first boat, is this beautiful thing, which I have to give credit. Roger Pawlowski painted this in 2016, and I'll talk a little bit about Roger and his colleagues in just a couple of minutes. But the sloop Washington, or Lady Washington, is the first boat to be launched at 4 Mile Creek in Erie, actually not far from my house, in 1797. So this is the first actual maritime imprint here in Erie. And the Pennsylvania Population Company are going to be the ones that actually bring it into being. So they're going to hire a contractor to come out of Connecticut and build this vessel. He's building this. It's a 36-ton sloop. It's used primarily to transport people, their belongings, and supplies. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to start to develop this tract of land to the north of Erie, and they're using this sloop to do so. So in September 15th, 1798, the sloop is launched. We don't really know much about the construction efforts, but again, what it does is it marks the first true vessel to be launched in Erie's recorded history. Pennsylvania Population Company are going to assume ownership of this vessel on October 12th, 1795. Christened Washington, Lady Washington, by the largest stakeholder, Robert Hamilton. And she would sail Lake Erie for a 3-year period before she's sold to Canadian merchants, and she begins sailing on Lake Ontario. So relatively impactful career. Once she's on Lake Ontario, we know she's sailing from April to roughly early November each year up until 1803. What we do know of this vessel is she set sail relatively late in the season, so November 6th, 1803, which I don't know if anybody's ever been to Lake Ontario in November. It's cold. Storms do creep up pretty often. And unfortunately for the crew of Lady Washington, she had $20,000 worth of cargo on board, and a storm came up, and shortly after setting sail, and she would go down with all souls. And we know that pieces of her wreck were found washed ashore shortly after near Oswego, New York. These 3 gentlemen, I had the privilege of meeting the one in the middle, Mr. Jim Kennard, one of the most fantastic people I've ever met, and a renowned maritime archaeologist. If you've ever watched any of the shows, I can't remember, I think where they drain the oceans, drain the seas, he's actually a regular speaker on that. He came to the museum, presented this. There's a book out that he wrote. It's a wonderful piece, but he's the one he and his comrades here, Roger Pawlowski and Roland Chip Stevens, were the 3 gentlemen that actually discovered the Lady Washington in 2016. It marked the oldest fully intact commercial sailing vessel to have ever been discovered on the Great Lakes. And what it did for archaeologists and historians is it gave people an idea of the different shipbuilding techniques that were used at this period in time. Photos galore, you can find videos online, but why am I talking about this? Well, because it is the first ship and boat, whatever you want to call it, to be built in Erie. So shipbuilding in Erie in the early 19th century, pretty rare for a short period of time, mostly because the population in Erie was really small, very small. So most of the typical vessels that we do have recorded to be found in Erie's harbor at this time were schooners. Schooners are easy to build, they're cheap, they're small. A typical schooner is 2-masted, 70 feet maybe, and we have a few records at this period in time. The Harlequin, the Good Intent, is the name of another one. In 1801, we have the Wilkinson being launched, which is a 65-ton vessel, and in 1805, the Mary, a 100-ton vessel. We start to see more ships be constructed at this point in time because there's a boom in the salt trade. So a lot of merchants are out hunting for vessels to sail around the Great Lakes, including the gentleman here on the left. This is Daniel Dobbins, and you're going to hear his name a lot over the next few slides specifically, but he quickly becomes one of the most prominent sailors and merchants on the Great Lakes in the early 1800s, 18 teens. He's born in Lewiston, Pennsylvania, and he had a ship called the Salina, which is specifically in July of 1812. He was delivering salt to Fort Mackinac on Lake Huron when the British launch an attack, capture the fort. He's paroled. He is sent away, basically told, hey, don't come back, don't support American war efforts. British are at war with the United States. He's like, yeah, okay, whatever. Sails off, and he's captured again when ironically he's in Detroit when the British attack and capture the fort at Detroit early on in the War of 1812. Somehow he finds his way to freedom, sails back to Erie via Cleveland, and he's going to arrive in Erie on August 24th, 1812. Why is this important? What does this have to do with shipbuilding history? Well, he's bringing the citizens of Erie news that the West has fallen, the Northwest has fallen. Forts Detroit and Fort Mackinac are in British hands, which is devastating. When he tells that, oops, sorry, I just hit the wrong button. When he tells that to the commander of the state's militia in Erie, Mr. Meade, he is is urged to go to Washington and tell the President Madison, that the West has fallen and we need to protect ourselves. So he does that. Dobbins suggests that a naval force be built on Lake Erie at Presque Isle because, as he describes, there's no finer wood, no finer oak that can be found anywhere in the world but here. So he returns to Erie with a $2,000 draft on Navy funds to construct 4 gunboats. $2,000 doesn't seem like a lot, but it is. To build a squadron in the wilderness is ridiculously challenging. We know that the journey from Erie to Buffalo, for example, at this point in time was dreaded because the weather and the land, there are no real road networks in this period, in this region. There are, but they're usually going to lead to, carts being encased in mud, depending on the time of year that you're traveling. We know that in April 1813, Mr. Dobbins writes that he started in Buffalo with 3 pieces of ordnance, only made it to Erie with 1. And he highlights the fact that there's a bad state of roads. The streams are not cooperating and bridges are being washed away. So it's a very difficult challenge to get anything they need to Erie. Also, we have poor supply lines. Many of the supply lines at this point in time were old Native American trails, which are high up in elevation, or French trails that connect, like portages and all that, connect forts. So they're very low country or very high, so very difficult. Only thing immediately available in Erie is lumber. Which unironically, if you look at Presque Isle, even today, a lot of really nice, beautiful trees. Steel had to be brought in from Meadville, which is today about a 40-minute drive to Erie. It's a laborious haul through wild country, as described later on by Dobbins as well. So all of our steel, everything that had to be brought in, or iron, I should say, came from elsewhere. So you can see in this image, really great representation because it actually shows you where each of the ships and gunboats were built. Do I have the ability to put a laser on? Okay, yeah. You can see Maritime Museum today is right about here where that laser is. We have the State Street, which is where the dock is. So to the west of that dock is where the smaller gunboats are going to be built. And if you look further west, you see Cascade Creek. At the mouth of Cascade Creek is where the larger vessels, the Brig Lawrence, Brig Niagara, and the Ariel are going to be constructed. It's a little bit deeper over there. We have the fort, they have blockhouses and hospital, all of that. So you can see Presque Isle over here. What makes this place great, in the sense that it offers protection, is that there is a sandbar right about here that is just a couple of feet on a good day below the surface of the water. That's a good thing for protection. However, it is noted very early on by senior naval officers that it might not be a good place to build ships, really, because how are you going to get them out? How are you going to get these larger draft vessels out into the lake to fight the British and win the day, right? Mr. Dobbins argues that that's a great thing. We can accomplish our task. We can get out to the lake. The protection is all the more important, right? So they're willing to take that risk and protect the vessels as they're being built, rather than have to build them somewhere else. Like, for example, at a place like Black Rock, which is near Buffalo, which is right across the way from a British fort. It was not the perfect place. So you look at a place like Presque Isle, and yeah, that sandspit that offers protection might have a bit of a challenge after the ships are built, but we'd rather risk that, not risk that, I should say. So Dobbins argues tooth and nail and finally gets it. Finally gets the Commodore Isaac Chauncey, who's overseeing all naval fleets on the Great Lakes, to permit the further construction of the vessels. And he's going to go come to Erie New Year's Day, 1813, and then immediately hires shipbuilder Noah Brown to come from New York City to Erie with 15 shipwrights and make their way to construct the American fleet at Presque Isle, which is going to start a naval station. They're going to come out. They have to travel 2 weeks, cross 450 miles of frozen tundra, and arrive. They find a small frontier town. They have to build their own places to live. But they also have a challenge of building gunboats, which have yet to be planked and fully constructed. So Brown's going to come in, Noah Brown's going to come in and leave Dobbins to go out and find supplies. So like I said, majority of shipbuilders, they're coming from places like New York, like Philly, Sackett's Harbor, Newport. It gives them a steady paycheck, but they have to travel to get here. Like I said, minimum 350 miles that they have to travel. They're going to, for example, places like New York. If you're coming from New York, you travel north up the Hudson, out from Albany to Buffalo, and then you have to find your way down the Lakeshore Road, which I don't know if anybody knows the interstate maps. You pretty much are following I-90, where the Erie Canal and all that runs through. For people in Philly, you're going to have an easier trip because there are a network of roads on the eastern side of the Commonwealth. But once you get to the Alleghenies, to Pittsburgh, you have to go over the mountains by way of Old Forbes Road, which adds to your trip. It's about a 5-week trip, which is absolutely horrendous. That's terrible. They're going to eventually hire a gentleman named Oliver Hazard Perry. He's going to come from Newport, Rhode Island. He is the guy. He's the guy that everybody knows when you're talking about the Battle of Lake Erie. Oliver Perry is the Commodore, the one who oversees the actual fleet action, but he also has to oversee the shipbuilding operation. And luckily for him, he's pretty knowledgeable in that regard. So he comes out from Newport with a contingent of sailors, and then immediately heads to Pittsburgh. So you can see this from this map. This is actually a display in the museum. All of these things, all these supplies have to come from elsewhere. You're not going to have cannons and all that, guns and textiles for sales readily available. They have to come from places like Philadelphia, like New York, like Pittsburgh, like Washington, and so on and so forth. To arm the vessels, for example, all of the guns that had to be cast came from Georgetown, and then up here in Sackett's Harbor, which is where the flag of the American Great Lake fleets would sit. So all of this stuff had to get to Presque Isle, which proved to be a challenge. The brig is launched on August 5th, 1813. And like I said, they had to do something to get them up and over the sandbar, all while the British are sailing out in the lake, and they spot the whole thing, but somehow they don't attack, which could have been devastating. But this process is called camelling, and camelling is effectively where they take 2 large pontoons and they run them alongside of the larger vessels. They would be placed somewhere like here and here. And they would float them up over the sandbar, all the while they're kedging and dragging the ship through the sand. And it took a few days actually to get them out into the lake and ready to fight. These ships, these American ships that were built to fight one battle, and that was pretty much it. So when they're chopping all these trees down, they're not drying them out properly. They're literally just putting them together and praying for the best. So a lot of what we talk about is the fact that the wood on these ships were green. So they were still, they were not perfectly molded, I guess you could say, and ready to go. As a green ship, that means once they fight that battle and they serve their purpose, there's really nothing more for them. So the Brig Niagara, along with the other vessels in the American squadron, were sent to Misery Bay, which is, let me try to go back, which is right about here at Presque Isle. So they're sitting here, and they would be unceremoniously scuttled, meaning they're going to sink them on purpose. The hope is if you need those vessels again, it's better to have them under the water than above the water in the elements. So from 1820 on, they sat beneath the waters in Presque Isle Bay. So yeah, Erie Shipbuilding, we have to talk about the revenue cutter service. The first revenue cutter service ship that was constructed in Erie was the Benjamin Rush. It was used in Erie throughout her service, launched in September 13th, 1828, and her station was Presque Isle District, PI Bay, as it's listed. Rush is a 30-ton vessel built by Captain John Richards under the command of Captain Gilbert Knapp, and then followed by Daniel Dobbins. So he's pretty much everywhere. Shortly after that, we have the Erie, which was a 60-ton schooner rig and built and placed in the care of, again, Daniel Dobbins, launched at Reed's Dock, which is the pier in Erie today. You can see it's the public dock. That's Reed's Dock. Launched in March of 1833. And then we have this beautiful thing. One of my favorite ships to talk about. I can't spend too much time on her, unfortunately, but this is the Steamship Erie, which was built obviously in her namesake in Erie. And according to newspaper articles and historians, the steamship was a specimen of accomplished workmanship in regard to strength and speed. A beautiful ship and very substantially built. As you can see from this painting, she is absolutely stunning. She is a passenger vessel. Her job was to move people and around wherever they had to go. So from Buffalo to Cleveland, that was her main trip, her main path. She was 176 feet in length, had a beam of 27.5 feet roughly, and a depth of 10 feet 8 inches. Had 497-ton vessel. So her ability was to carry 300 people, 250 of which were passengers, and the remaining were crew. So I'm going to get into this real quick. 12 staterooms, 3 lifeboats, and had 60 to 100 life preservers. She is owned and basically funded by Charles Manning Reed, the great grandson of the founder of Erie, Seth Reed, the first settler of Erie. Maiden voyage in May of 1838, so she is launched at the foot of, I think, French Street in May of 38, scheduled to travel from Erie to Buffalo, then Buffalo to Cleveland, and on her first trip, the engine failed, so she had to be towed to Cleveland. Fortunately, that was an okay omen because she did last for another few years. In June of 1838, she actually sets the speed record for a ship in the Great Lakes, traveling from Erie to Buffalo in just over 5 hours, which is pretty incredible. In operation for 3 sailing seasons, however, unfortunately, and you could read about this, there's a few books. The best one I would recommend is Alvin Oichel's Disaster on Lake Erie. But on the evening of August 9th, 1841, she commenced her final run from Buffalo, fully loaded with approximately 350 people on board. Unfortunately, there was an overpressurization, and coming from one of her vent ports in close proximity to highly flammable paint, which caught fire and spread within seconds. So the ship's captain went looking for life preservers, but the flames were already so intense that he could not get to the ladies' cabin where they were stored. Flames also quickly reached the boilers. They were unable to get to the boilers, and the pilot was directed to turn the ship starboard hard and try to get nearer to land. But when they did, 2 of the lifeboats were sunk and capsized. The third and final lifeboat was deployed. However, they didn't get nearly anybody on that. Unfortunately, when all is said and done, there were less than 100 survivors rescued. By 1 a.m., all of the survivors had been picked up. The lake was quiet, and they had planned to try and tow the remains of the Erie to shore, but she would sink around dawn that same morning. So absolutely horrendous disaster just off the shore of Dunkirk, New York, for it, again, in my opinion, one of the more beautiful vessels ever built in Erie, as you can see her in all her splendor. So like I said, if that's something you're interested in, I highly recommend reading more about that. Then we have the first iron-hulled warship to ever be built by the United States Navy was put together, assembled, I guess, for lack of better words, in Erie, Pennsylvania. This is the USS Michigan. She would eventually be renamed USS Wolverine in 1905, but this is USS Michigan in her white paint scheme, livery, depending on where you're from. But this is how she would look. She was initially black, and talk a little bit about why she was constructed. She's constructed because the British government are going to start arming 2 steamers. So after the War of 1812, there was a treaty that said, hey, you got to limit what type of vessels and how much armament you have on the Great Lakes. The British are going to arm 2 steamers during the Canadian Rebellion. So Secretary of the Navy says, you know what, we're going to build one, and we're going to build one out of iron. It's an immense resource, and our country has a lot of it. So this is more or less a practice run for the future of the Navy, but this iron-hulled vessel was designed by Sam Hart, who hired out Stackhouse and Tomlinson to fabricate the ship in Pittsburgh out of Erie, or out of iron, I mean. So Stackhouse and Tomlinson actually were contracted to construct parts of supplies, I should say, for the U.S. Brig Niagara and Lawrence during the War of 1812. So a little bit of another connection there. These parts are going to be carried in sections to Cleveland for more work, and then eventually transported to Erie by oxen teams for final construction. So the vessel was put together in all her glory at Front Street in Erie. Constructors were 100% certain in their mind that the ship would sink due to her weight, but she did not. She would sail for 79 years. And when finished, USS Michigan did become the first iron hull naval ship. Let me turn this off real quick. That pointer is driving me nuts. 168 feet long, 27-foot beam with a 10-foot draft, could carry a considerable amount with the 600 tons. Initially rigged as a barkentine, so she did have a sailing rig because that was a backup if the engines were to go out or couldn't be trusted fully. However, if you see that smokestack, those sails that were rigged right behind that smokestack were easy to catch a fire, so they kind of reconfigured the rig a little bit, and I think she became eventually like a topsail schooner, kind of. So with the launch of USS Michigan, she was at least 2 decades ahead of the rest of the world in the grand scheme of things. The launch was a bit of an adventure, and it's a story that our volunteers like to tell a lot at the Maritime Museum. So on December 5th, 1843, with Sam Hart, the ship's designer, to its side, the dream ship, as he called it, was poised to slide into Presque Isle Bay that morning. However, she would get stuck in her ways. So as she was sliding down, she got stuck on her launch. So they tried for hours and hours and hours. Finally, Sam Hart and his crew, after 6 hours of working, they just stopped. Darkness came, and when they returned the next morning, to the dismay of the onlookers from yesterday or from the day before, the ship had actually launched herself into the bay on her own. And I quote, they were dumbfounded, sitting in the bay waiting to go to action. So as you can see here in this amazing photo, which again is part of our collections, in 1913, USS Wolverine at the time would be called upon to tow the US Brig Niagara in the centennial celebrations following the Battle of Lake Erie. So you can see her there. So yeah, she was crewed for 79 years, and her prow is actually on display in the Maritime Museum. So now get into the 1880s to 1990s. We talk about the Erie's boat building past, and I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the different boat builders out of Erie. First being W.W. Loomis, who is he's the first major boat builder. He starts his operation in 1860s roughly. Moves to Erie at the age of 10. From Northeast PA, not Northeast geographically. Northeast is a town to the northeast of Erie, in the far northwestern corner of Pennsylvania. Ironically, it took me some getting used to for that when I first moved here. So he opens up in, I think, 1863. Very hardworking man, is said to have worked 12-hour days. His yard is actually right next door to the museum at the foot of Holland, where Don John Boat Building, Shipbuilding and Repair sits. And he builds Erie's first floating dry dock. But he's very, very well known for he's building sail and steam vessels. He's the last true Erie shipbuilder to focus wholly on the Great Lakes. He's building steamers like the Barnhurst and the Kate White. But what he's mostly known for is this type of vessel that you see, this type of watercraft known as the Erie boat, which is very shallow, made to be able to bring in great hauls of fish, because Erie at the time was the freshwater fishing capital in the world. So that's what the focus was here. Rig style is pulled from a ship design in upstate New York. They're approximately 28 feet by 8 foot in draft, I should say. But yeah, unfortunately, W.W. Loomis was killed at the age of 50 in a head-on train collision. But one of the more prominent of Erie shipbuilders, after his death on August, I think it was August of 1887. I could be wrong. After his death, Mrs. Loomis puts up his shipyard for sale. That's pretty much the end of his story, unfortunately. But his legend lives on. You can see a model of the Erie boat today in the Maritime Museum. Then we get into the Pash Brothers. Harold Pash is one of the more reputable builders in recent memory, but he comes from a long line of boat builders. His grandfather, John, we know he was an ocean-going ship carpenter. He moves to Erie, and like so many before him, when he laid sights on Presque Isle Bay, he knew it was a place for him to settle. Captain Pash will open his business, the grandfather of Harold, as I mentioned, in the 1870s to 1880s. So the Pash family is called upon in 1913. We're going to talk a little bit about that in just a few minutes, to reconstruct the US Brig Niagara in 1913. William Pash, which is the uncle of Howard, or Harold, I mean, is overseeing that 1913 reconstruction. When the ship is raised, he comes up with this plan to cut a hole in the ice, because they want to bring the Brig Niagara out for the centennial celebration. He's going to cut a hole in the ice, run some chains around the hull, raise the vessel. Then he lets the ice form around the hull of the vessel so they can drag her back to shore for reconstruction. The Pash family are going to open a 93-foot dry dock on the east slip of State Street not long after they open, but they're mostly known for the Niagara reconstruction, as well as building fishing tugs. And you can see here, this is an example of an engine for one of those fishing tugs that they would have constructed. If you look on the nameplate, the maker's mark, Pash Bros, Erie, PA. By the time of World War II, the younger Pash, he's working for American Boiler Works at the foot of State Street. They're building landing craft for Allied forces right in Erie. He eventually opens the modern Pash Shipyard, known for repairing and constructing vessels, but mostly repairing. He pioneers aluminum shipbuilding construction, creating and designs commercial boats and yachts with that lightweight material. And you can see a couple of his vessels that he built, the J.W. Westcott II, which is with the U.S. Postal Service up in the top left, and down at the bottom right, the Anthony Celebrezzi, which is a fire boat. So there's that. Then we get into Lund. Lund is named after Herman Lund, which emigrated to the U.S. from Denmark in 1907. He gets a job working for William Pash. We know that he was born in 1890, began boat building approximately 1904, so shortly before he arrives in the U.S. He opens a shipbuilding or boat building yard with his uncle Hans. and they were subcontractors on the 1913 reconstruction efforts at the brig. So they're also working on that. So you can see a lot of cross-pollination and collaboration. He's eventually hired on as a carpenter for the Brig Niagara's tour of the Great Lakes in 1913, comes back, takes full ownership of Lund Shipyard Boatworks, and primarily works on building tugs, fishing tugs, because that was the industry at the time. He's also building patrol boats for the Coast Guard, but he's also working on building some fast boats in the rum running arena. After World War II, he starts building sailboats and yachts for personal use. The ever smart businessman, he would sail his yachts to Florida each year, and rather than sail back, he would sell his yachts. We know that he sold 6 over the course of 10 winters, and that's where he really made his name. His most famous yacht was the Westerly, which we have tons of photos of. I wish I put it in here, and I didn't think about it until I started talking, that I should have. But we know that that's what he had done. And then finally, we have James W. Nolan, who's the last real boat builder of the Big Four. He's building. He's known mostly for his welding technique of welding a continuous seam. And that's something we call the Nolan technique today. It basically would solve the problem of water buckling on hulls and all that kind of stuff. So very important guy. His business would fold in 1992 and kind of puts an end to major boat building in Erie. Then we have this here. By the dawn of World War II, we have W.E. McCain, Erie Concrete and Steel. They are mostly working contracted to local boat builders to build welded steel tugs. But eventually, with World War II coming, he goes to the Department of the Navy and says, hey, I'll build small yard freighters and yard ferries. They're going to be laying mines in support of fleets for protection. And that's what he does. So you can see here the YF 734, which is one of those yard ferries that were built here in Erie. After the Second World War, they would remain at Cascade Docks and mostly work in the repair business. Then in 1968, we have Erie's Marine Division of Lytton Industries, which comes here. They're going to design and construct 1,000-foot freighters focused on sailing in the Great Lakes. They're going to open Lytton Yards, which is right next door. It's in operation today as Don John. And they construct ships like these, or boats, I should say, like the Stuart J. Court, which is the lake's first true super freighter, Hull 1173, as you can see. This is affectionately known as Stubby because you can see her aft and her brow stitched together, quite literally. They had to cut her apart and put the midsections together once it got to Erie. So you can see this. It was a 72-foot bow, 110-foot stern, built in Pascagoula, Mississippi, welded together, sent up the Mississippi, and cut and widened and reassembled in Erie. So we do have a sister ship of her. We were supposed to have a sister ship, a sister boat to Court, but that was canceled after the Court was launched on May 4th, 1971. Now, kind of go quickly because I know I'm running out of time and I apologize. The reconstruction of the Brig Niagara, where our current brig is the 4th iteration of the Brig Niagara, the ship that won the Battle of Lake Erie. In 1820, she was scuttled, as I'd mentioned, and in 1911, they start fundraising to bring her back up for the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Lake Erie. So they contract William Pash, and I say they, I mean William Leverett Morrison, who's the guy he's captaining the USS Wolverine. He's the first superintendent of Presque Isle State Park. The guy is pretty well known here in the Erie circle, but he is starting fundraising to raise that ship. And he says to William Pash, I need you to lead the operation. So they start the actual rebuild of the brig at Crystal Point. 10% of the original ship is used in the reconstruction. So very little of the second version of the brig is the original. First visitors are going to board the ship from July 6th to the 12th, 1813. She tours the Great Lakes, come back, and she will sit, and she'll sit, and she'll sit. By 1928, the 1913, the second version, was found to be sinking in her mooring lines. They start a restore. The goal to do that at least starts the planning process in the 1920s, just before the Great Depression. So you can imagine that halted plans for a rebuild of the Niagara for that time. The Flagship Niagara Commission is established at that point with cooperation from the state. They appropriate $50,000 for another reconstruction, but it takes decades at this point. The 125th anniversary of the Battle of Lake Erie comes to pass. Finally, in 1939, the PA Historical Commission, so the predecessor to the PHMC, takes ownership. FDR appropriates $10,000 to help the reconstruction effort. But again, it takes time. And in 1958, the hull of Niagara III was launched without masts, spars, and sails. And she would sit there. Cradle, she's put up on a concrete cradle, as you can see here. Rot is discovered. 1956, they discover rot. It's rigged finally in 1963, rededicated for the 150th anniversary. But again, it just sits there. It sits on land. 1984, $1 million is authorized by the Pennsylvania legislature to reconstruct the modern Niagara, to build the modern Niagara. 1986, we hire shipbuilder Melbourne Smith to lead design efforts, and construction began. So on May 7th of that year, the keel is laid. On September 10th, at the 175th anniversary of the Battle of Lake Erie, the hull is launched into Presque Isle Bay. Finally get masts steeped in. We embed the coins, which was an 1810 silver dollar, three 1990 dollars as well. And then on July 18th, 1990, Niagara's sea trials were held, and the ship is commissioned the official flagship of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and something we still fly, the Pennsylvania flag. We fly the 15-star, 15-stripe American flag from the War of 1812, as well as Oliver Hazard Perry's battle flag, the Don't Give Up the Ship flag. And to this day, she's a sail training vessel. So we have people from around the world coming on board to sail that ship, which you can see here, built painstakingly, as accurate as we possibly could. And there she is today. So as I'd mentioned, just some stuff that I'll show you, and then I'll close it up. We have hundreds, it feels like, of shipbuilding tools, including this caulking mallet, which a caulking mallet was used with a caulking iron to drive in oakum, to seal a ship watertight, completely watertight. So we have this, as well as this iron here. This iron spike was found, I believe, in Sackett's Harbor, New York, but it gives you a good idea of the different types of spikes used to build ships at this point in time. So yeah, as I'm wrapping up, just want to say, shipbuilding is a neat industry, like fishing and military. It brought throngs of people to the shores of Presque Isle Bay. She was a hub of shipbuilding industry from the 1790s to the 1990s, so 200 years of Erie history and heritage. And we at the Maritime Museum are try our best to preserve the memory of those who've come to these shores to build these ships, to build these boats, to serve on these vessels, like the Niagara and Lawrence and the Stuart J. Court and the Julie Marie, all the different types of boats that sailed these beautiful lakes. I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak with people from around the country, around the world, in these Zoom calls. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you so much. Even though you said that you didn't give this presentation very often, you sound very knowledgeable to me.
Thank you.
I had along the way. So at this point, if anyone else has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask Charles, or you can put it in the chat box and I can read it out. I see there's a good job, Charles, already in there.
Thank
so.
you. Thank you so much. Oh, you guys are shy. Thank you. I love when I see people who visited Presque Isle. I myself am from Massachusetts. So when I came here, I was in awe with the geography and the land and all that kind of stuff. It is a beautiful place. That's cool that you visited.
Well, in addition to a lot of other things, I learned how to actually pronounce it today. Definitely didn't pronounce it that way.
That's okay. I learned about the War of 1812 4 years ago. So thank you. You're up in Erie. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation.
Yeah.
When was the heyday of fishing on Lake Erie, and when did it somewhat fall off along with fishing boat building?
Yeah, so the late 19th century to the mid 20th is when I'd say the heyday. Overfishing kind of drove the industry out, which is unfortunate because, you know, like I said, it brought a lot of people here. A lot of really neat inventions came out of that as well. We have flash freezing was invented in Erie by the Colby family. So you're seeing a lot of these things and coming here for boat building and for fishing and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Don. Any other questions? Like I said, I love seeing these messages. I'm so glad that people came out for tall ships and have visited Presque Isle and all that kind of stuff. And to see, I think it's Jan Westcott, maybe, grew up in Erie, which is really cool. So
yes, it's very interesting. We have such a large state. And I think people just forget about how varied it could be from here to the other side. So
right.
I'm glad that people have been exploring. I will send out this recording again if you want to rewatch this, and I'll see if I can find any information that we have at the library. It's for everyone to explore this topic more, but I personally am a fan of road trips, so hopefully this inspires people to take a road trip out there.
Definitely.
So if we don't have anyone else have a question tonight, I'm just going to end it for all. And I'm just going to once again thank all of you. And don't forget to check our website, which is ivpl.org, on the calendar for more events.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.